In the months before Choi fell, Martin had already been thinking about leaving town, maybe to Chile or one of these former Soviet bloc countries. This story is also historical. It's set in the early 90s. You would figure that out probably, but one of these former Soviet bloc countries where you could be a prince with a couple $100s in your bank account. Who knew? He'd been scanning the items for sale in the dispatch, checking out what kind of cut-rate plane tickets people were getting rid of. So far, there'd been a one-way ticket to Reykjavik. That turned out to be in Iceland. No thanks. As well as tickets to Dallas and Amarillo. Why were there so many excess tickets to the state of Texas? And, he wondered, how did some place called Amarillo even have an airport? He'd been in Columbus for going on 8 months, but the place was seriously wearing thin. The gunshots out his window at night and the ubiquitous circling police helicopters, the sitting around in traffic you had to do to get anywhere. But mostly it was the fact that since losing his job at Penny's, he couldn't find another one. There didn't seem to be any decent jobs anywhere. He'd spent a day crushing hard plastic beams into tiny pieces with a sledge. For what purpose was anyone's guess. And another holding up a sign at the corner of Bethel and Sawmill for Little Caesar's Pizza, 39 degrees outside. Those were not good days. He'd stopped going to the temp agency that got him those gigs. It's a bit of a recession, the lady there had told him by way of an apology. Normally, she said, these jobs would go to other types of clients. Here, her eyes swept the room in both directions, like those lurking behind a painting. She meant Mexicans, Martin knew. A mini recession was what they called it on the news, whatever that meant. Martin didn't know or care if it was a recession or a great goddamn depression. As far as he could tell, it was just a plain old shite market. That's what they would have called it in England, what they probably were calling it in England, where Martin had lived for a few months with the family when he was 16. He hadn't really retained many memories about the place, not Stonehenge or the Cliffs of Dover or Buckingham Palace, all of which the family had dutifully dragged him to. The town where he'd spent the summer was called Chester, not far from Liverpool, and it was not so different from his own crappy hometown in Ohio. The only saving grace was the way everyone talked. That was all by itself worth the trip. Shagging meant having sex, mental meant crazy, gobbling was slang for a blowjob. It was hilarious. When he got back to Washburn, Martin tried to bring some of it with him, but nobody got it. They thought he was being pretentious, which was infuriating. The whole thing had been his dad's idea, and he'd set it up with an old friend of his, a guy he'd known from when he was stationed in England 40-some years back. Martin had heard the boring stories many times and the nostalgia in his dad's voice as he talked about England and mostly about its beer. The Air Force was over there keeping an eye on the commies, according to his dad, never a particularly reliable storyteller, though that more or less checked out when Martin asked his 10th grade history teacher about it. But then everything went to hell when his dad's bomber group was transferred out of good old fish and chips with the stout England and sent to stinking, corrupt, VD-infested Japan in case they were needed there, which it turned out they weren't, because the old Second War bombers were too slow to deal with the Russian-made MiGs the Chinese were flying for the North Koreans. Martin's dad had never really gotten past his hatred of Koreans for ruining the good time he was having up to Oxfordshire. It had been through his dad's connections, though, that he'd also gotten the sweet job at JCPenney's mothership distribution center, driving a van around with tricycles and boxes of underwear to suburban malls. Obviously, the idea was to get Martin on his feet after high school graduation, and more importantly, out of the house. During the nearly 4 months at Penny's, he'd had his own place, a one-bedroom apartment, in a brand new low-slung building just outside the city's outer belt, on the east side, not 5 minutes from work. The day he'd signed the lease, fronting over $1,200 in first and last month in security deposit, most of it graduation money, was a great day. All of the way out there, Martin's bachelor pad, there'd been no helicopters. At that point, he hadn't even known that there could be such a thing. The nightlife wasn't much, but he had a car, a Chevette, but still. And also, the job had been super easy, a no-brainer you could do high, which he sometimes did. Lots of guys did their jobs high. Even the forklift operators who got piss tested on a regular basis mostly did their jobs high. They apparently had a number of systems in place to deal with the drug tests, though Martin wasn't around long enough to figure out what those were. But when the market turned really shite, who knew where these things originated and how the results of that finally reached someone like Martin? He'd gotten called into the small office near Dock 16, really just a closet with a large window on one of the walls that looked out onto the loading area. He'd only been in there one other time the day he got hired. His foreman, Tom Barrett, said nothing, just made dispirited faces, contortions of his cheeks and lips, until Martin had said, "So I'm fired then?" Barrett made a noise, a clicking with his tongue, in order to confirm. Little guy on the fucking totem pole or what? Martin wanted to know. Barrett nodded, waited. Do I at least get a few weeks to look for something? Barrett held up his thumb and index finger the way they do in Europe, which Martin thought odd. From beginning to end, Barrett never actually uttered a word. It was like being let go by a mime. When he left the office, he walked past Clay Black, who was also a van driver, and Jerome Tolley, who worked on the floor in the warehouse. Oh shit, Black said when he saw Martin approaching. Whether he had picked up on something in Martin's posture or was in some possession of some inside knowledge, Martin wasn't sure. What? Tolley wondered, looking up from where he was taping some boxes that had gotten eaten by the mechanical sorter. Look at young Martin, Jerome. I bet $3 he's been made redundant. Tolley looked at Martin, squinting. The fuck's that mean? Laid off, Black said. He's become part of the great let go. It's happening everywhere. You get the paper? Shut up, Clay, Tolley said. What's the deal, son? I'm fucking toast, Martin said. It's the economy, stupid, Clay said. It's killing us all by increments. It's capitalism is what it is. Shut up, man, Tolley said. You think this dude needs to hear your philosophies right now? I'm off, Martin said, though just then he didn't know to where. He was still stunned. The great let go, Black repeated, apparently lost in his own world now. Good luck, son, Tolley said. He rode things out for a month, mostly relying on his Sega Saturn for companionship, but his bank account, never robust, dwindled, and he'd had to give the place up. He lost his security deposit in the process because he was breaking his lease, and so he screamed at the cigarette-smoking blue hair who managed the place, Edna something, or maybe Ida. I'm sorry, hon, she said. Reality is harsh. Believe me, I know. But yelling isn't going to get your deposit back. He seethed. She went back to her accounting calculator, entering figures, a cigarette smoldering in a full and obviously ancient Baltimore Colts ashtray. God damn it, he said, and slammed the glass doors in the complex behind him, thankful afterward that the doors hadn't broken. Next, there were 2 days of living back in his old basement bedroom and his parents in Washburn. That was another bad couple of days, the culmination of which was his dad hitting him in the jaw late in the afternoon of the second day, both of them drunk. Afterward, he stood on the front stoop with his bag. He'd never unpacked, unsure of how things would play out there. Looking out across the old neighborhood, he could practically see into the dim light of his future, which he could feel was already just months out of high school, veering toward catastrophe or some similar fate. He saw, or perhaps merely felt, that he'd misjudged things, starting some time back. He spent the next night with Frank Steller, a high school friend he hadn't talked to since May. Frank was in his first quarter at Ohio State, what Frank and his friends called the OSU. While Martin talked through his next move, they smoked some weed Martin had bought from a shady long-haul Penny's driver. I could do fucking anything, he told Frank. I could go to Israel and work on a kibbutz. I could join the army. What's a kibbutz? Frank wanted to know. I don't know. It's like a commune. It's supposed to be a pretty sweet time, huge hookup scenario. Some guy I met at Penny's had done it and told me that it was just too many girls. Israel, Frank said, are you supposed to be Jewish? I don't know the details, man. Well, either way, Frank said, I wouldn't do that. People are blowing shit up over there all the time. And I especially wouldn't join the army, man. That's a real bad idea. He shrugged. Get me out of here. Will Sennett joined, and he's stationed in Germany, smoking himself some cheap PX cigarettes, probably hooking up with German girls like that kid on European Vacation. You remember that girl? Nobody can forget that girl, Frank said. But you know that was a movie. Whatever. I'd go Air Force if I had to go military, Frank offered. Why walk when you can fly, Martin scoffed. My dad always says that. It's bullshit. The Air Force is just as much bullshit as the Army. Your call, Frank said. It's not my life. Man, Martin said, I wish I had my old job back. I wish we didn't live in such a crappy country where everything was going to hell all the time. Dude, Frank said. What? Nothing. I got to go to bed. Go to bed, Martin said. You know you can only stay here a night or two, he said. My RA's kind of a dick. Yeah, okay, thanks, man. I'll be out of your hair. Martin drank the rest of the beer by himself. There were just 2 left from the 12 he bought with his fake ID, and he looked out from the 11th floor of the high-rise dorm toward campus, and beyond that, the city of Columbus, glowing dimly out there in the ether. Close by was the stadium, placid at this hour, floodlights running along the upper deck, casting an early dawn's worth of light on the field. Thank you.